War is a bitter reminder of the human capacity for destruction. Lives get shattered, cities reduced to rubble, and generations scared. But amidst the devastation, stories emerge that bear witness to the extraordinary price paid for power, ideology, and territorial ambitions. We are going to uncover the top 10 most expensive wars that shook our world to its core. From ancient empires to modern conflicts, we'll unravel the secrets behind colossal budgets, astronomical casualties, and the indomitable human spirit. The values we are going to be seeing today are adjusted to present-day values due to inflation. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Here is a spoiler. The US is involved in almost all of these wars. Number 10. The Second Sino-Japanese War. One of the most expensive wars in history was actually fought between China and Japan. This war was called the Second Sino-Japanese War, and it went on from 1937 to 1945. This war was fought exactly right alongside World War II. This war was very unique and was quite a big deal for a particular reason. It didn't just happen in Europe like the other war. Nope, it spread across different parts of the world. But here's the surprise. You won't find it talked about much in Western history books because it didn't directly involve the Allied forces. During the peak of the war, Japan was spending a crazy amount of money on the war. Get this, they were shelling out around 8 billion yen every single month. Now, figuring out the exact amount in today's dollars is a bit tricky because we have to consider inflation. To give you a rough idea, it could be somewhere between $413 million and $1.3 billion per month. The reason for the big range is that it's super hard to find an inflation calculator for the yen during World War II. If you convert the yen to US dollars and then adjust for inflation, it's about $1.3 billion. But if you factor in inflation first and then convert to US dollars, you have to use numbers from the mid-1950s, which is like 10 years later. Number 9. The American Civil War. Before the Civil War started, the United States was already in debt. Yep, they owed about $64.8 million back in 1861. But hold on tight because things got even more expensive during the war. By the time it ended, the debt had skyrocketed to around $5.2 billion. Now let's put that into perspective. If we adjust that amount for inflation, it reaches a hopping $87 billion in today's dollars. That's a whole lot of moolah. Now let's talk about how the government managed to finance this costly war. In 1862, they came up with a plan called the Legal Tender Act. Basically, they sold $500 million in bonds, which means they borrowed money from people. But that's not all. They also started producing paper money called greenbacks. These were special because they weren't backed by gold, unlike previous paper bills. Instead, they were like IOUs from the government. People could use them to buy groceries or pay taxes, with the understanding that the government would eventually make good on that money. It was a big deal, and everyone had to trust that the government would keep its promises. Now let's dive into some more numbers. Some estimates put the total cost of the war at around $7 billion. This includes not only the expenses of war, but also the immeasurable loss of life. It's a bit tricky to put a value on human life, you know. But based on these figures, the northern states spent about $139 per person. That's just a bit less than their annual income per person. On the other hand, in the southern states, the cost was roughly 3 times higher. It was a tough and costly time for everyone involved. Number 8. The Korean War. Remember that book, movie, and TV show MASH? It was all about the Korean War, and it had some hilarious moments. But let me tell you, the cost of that war was definitely no laughing matter. When it finally came to an end in 1953, the bill added up to a staggering $30 billion. And get this, if we adjust that for inflation, it balloons up to over $308 billion. That's a mind-boggling amount. Now let's talk about the human toll of the war. It lasted for a grueling 3 years, and during that time, 36,000 Americans tragically lost their lives. But that's not all. The impact was even more devastating for the Korean people themselves. Over 1 million South Korean civilians and 200,000 North Korean civilians lost their lives. It's heart-wrenching to think about the immense loss and suffering that took place during those years. The Korean War may have inspired some funny stories and entertainment, but we must never forget the true cost it exacted in terms of lives lost and the enormous financial burden it placed on nations. Number 7. The Vietnam War. In Vietnam, this war is referred to as the American War, while to the rest of the world, we remember it as the Vietnam War. It all started back in 1959, but the United States didn't really get involved until 1965. They stuck around until 1973, making it a total of 8 long years. Now, get ready for some mind-blowing numbers. During those years, the US spent a jaw-dropping $168 billion on the war. That's a whole lot of cash. And get this, they even gave $28.5 billion as an aid to the people of southern Vietnam. Now let's adjust those numbers for inflation. If we bring it all the way to the end of the war, it's just over $1 trillion. Whoa! But if we start from 1969, it reaches a hopping $1.25 trillion. Can you even imagine how much money that is? But here's something truly astonishing. The Vietnam War is still costing money to this day. Veterans and their families are receiving compensation at an annual rate of $22 billion. That's a huge amount. Since 1970, the total benefits given to veterans have added up to about $270 billion. It's a way for the government to show their gratitude and support for the brave soldiers who fought in Vietnam. You see, veterans of the Vietnam War and their families are entitled to benefits. Even spouses, if their partner died because of the war, and their children receive support until they become adults. It's important to understand that many veterans face challenges like PTSD, which wasn't treated before Vietnam. They were also exposed to harmful substances which caused various diseases. That's why the government will continue to provide benefits for years to come, honoring the sacrifices made by individuals who put their lives on the line. Number 6. The Iraq War. This war started in 2003 and officially ended in 2011, but troops have pretty much been stationed there ever since. Now, let's jump to numbers. The total cost of this war has been estimated at a whopping $1.9 trillion. That's an unimaginable amount of money. This figure covers a wide range of expenses, all the things needed for war. Think about soldiers on the ground and the equipment they use. But here's the shocking part. A lot of that money was actually stolen. You see, money meant for contractors in both Iraq and Afghanistan was misused. In fact, it's been estimated that up to 1/3 of the money allocated for contracting was spent on fraudulent claims. That means some contractors were overbilling the government to fill their own pockets. Between Iraq and Afghanistan, this shady business added up to a staggering $31 billion to $60 billion. In total, a whopping $138 billion was paid to contractors, whether their claims were legitimate or not. Number 5. The Afghanistan War. This conflict feels like it's been going on forever. Is it officially over? Well, maybe, but the truth is, it lasted for more than 2 decades, and the situation in the region is far from stable. So, we can't exactly say mission accomplished just yet. Now get ready to hear about the huge budgets that were cut out for this war. The cost of this war is jaw-dropping. Can you believe it? The general consensus is that it added up to a staggering $2.3 trillion. That's an enormous amount of money. To put it into perspective, it's like spending around $300 million every single day for years. Now let's break down how that money was spent, although it's not the easiest thing to understand. A whopping $800 billion went directly towards expenses like salaries for soldiers and equipment. Another $85 billion was used to train the Afghan army. But unfortunately, the Taliban, a powerful group, swiftly defeated that army in just a matter of days. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? On top of that, $750 million went into paying salaries for the Afghan army. That's a lot of money too. And let's not forget the other costs. There's money spent on helping injured veterans who bravely in the war, as well as interest on all the money being spent in the first place. Number 4. The American War of 1812. This war created a financial mess that took almost 20 years to fix. By the end of the war, the government found itself in deep trouble, owing a staggering $158 million. A big chunk of that money, around $90 million, went to fund the Army and Navy. Now, let's imagine adjusting those numbers for today's prices. It's like sinking a mind-boggling $2.8 trillion into the whole endeavor. That's an enormous amount of money. By 1814, things were looking really bad for the government. They were completely broke. They couldn't pay back their loans and couldn't even cover their regular expenses. Imagine not being able to pay your bills. Even worse, the soldiers who fought in the war didn't receive their paychecks for up to a whole year. To make up for it, the government made a deal with them. They offered soldiers land in exchange for their service. They promised up to 320 acres of land to any soldier who stayed until the end of the war, despite not getting paid. But here's an interesting twist. Private millionaires came to the rescue. People like David Parrish, Stephen Girard, and John Jacob Astor stepped up and helped the country by paying off a big chunk of the debt. Together, they contributed nearly $16 million. In today's dollars, that's like $250 million. Their generosity and support played a huge role in getting the country back on its financial feet. Number 3, the First World War. Let's travel back to the First World War, a global conflict that shook the world and emptied everyone's pockets. Although not as expensive as World War II, it still left a huge dent in the collective bank account. The war cost somewhere between $185 billion and $208 billion at the time, but when you adjust for inflation from 1918, you're looking at somewhere about $3.3 trillion bill. Germany bore the heaviest financial burden, which makes sense considering their involvement. They spent over $37 billion in wartime dollars, equivalent to about $686 billion today. The United States managed to get by with an investment of $414 billion, while the British spent $641 billion. It's safe to say that when it comes to finances, nobody came out as the winner in this war. The impact on the German economy was remarkable and almost comically absurd. Some parts of Germany experienced hyperinflation that was beyond belief. Can you imagine paying $428 billion German marks for a loaf of bread? The value of the marks had plummeted to a point where they were practically worthless. Just to give you an idea, $1 was worth 4,210,500,000,000 marks. That's a mind-boggling 4.2 trillion. Germany had essentially destroyed its own economy to fund the war, and the aftermath of this economic devastation played a role in paving the way for Hitler's rise to power. Number 2, the Second World War. The Second World War is arguably the most expensive war in history. When adjusted for inflation, it's estimated that this war had a price tag of $4.7 trillion. To put that into perspective, in the final year of the war, the money spent accounted for a massive 40% of the entire United States GDP. That's a huge chunk of the country's wealth. Compare that to the modern wars we have today, which are still hitting the trillion-dollar mark. But let me tell you, the scale of World War II was on a whole different level. Back then, the military had a staggering 12.2 million deployed soldiers, while today we have around 2.5 million. Can you imagine the sheer magnitude of it? All that money was used for some incredible things. They bought a mind-blowing 41 billion rounds of ammunition, 303,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and 27 aircraft carriers, among many other expenses. To keep men in the military, they paid privates $50 a month. Now that might not sound like much today, but back then, it was actually more than what most salaried professionals made. It just goes to show how different things were in those times. Number 1, the Cold War. Let's talk about a war that was unlike any other, the Cold War. Now, technically, it wasn't a traditional war with troops storming battlefields, but it was still an intense and costly conflict. In fact, when it comes to expenses, the Cold War takes the crown. Lasting from 1940 to 1996, this war revolved around the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. If we tally up the money spent by the US alone, it's a jaw-dropping $5.8 trillion. Can you even wrap your head around that number? And remember, the Soviet Union also poured a massive amount of money into their side of the conflict, although it's hard to pinpoint the exact figure. So it's safe to say that the worldwide price tag for the Cold War and the upkeep of nuclear weapons was probably over a staggering $10 trillion. The Cold War was a war of ideologies and power, with nations investing astronomical sums to maintain their nuclear arsenals. These numbers remind us of the immense cost, both in terms of money and human lives, that wars like these can bring. It's important to reflect on these figures and strive for peaceful solutions whenever possible. Like and subscribe.